Good evening. I'm Sandeep and I'm the policy analyst here at Manans, and today's video is going to be about trade wars. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to the world's economic news is probably aware of what's going on. The US and China have been battling it out economically with regards to sanctions and unfair trade practices. Donald Trump's been talking about China's unfair trade practices ever since he started campaigning back in 2016, and he always threatened to do something about it, and guess what? He has done something about it. He's not only imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, he's also imposed tariffs on his allies' goods, such as Canada and Mexico and the European Union. Now, the trade war it's something that's going to affect the entire world just because of how globalized the economy is today. And that's why I think it's important that we talk about it and discuss it and sort of explain exactly what's going on, because it is necessary that people are aware of exactly how this is going to affect them. But before we do that, we should probably talk about what exactly a trade war is, how the whole thing works, and how it's panned out in the past. So what is a trade war? Well, a trade war it usually occurs when one country is unhappy with another country's trade practices. And the only real way they can retaliate is by imposing tariffs and import duties on their goods. So for example, right now what Trump has done is that he's imposed steel tariffs on Canadian steel and Chinese steel and European steel. And what this does is it makes steel a lot more expensive to be purchased by Americans. So this puts them off from buying it. Now, this affects both the Americans who are the buyers, and it also affects the producers from countries like China, because on the one hand, the Americans rely on cheap steel to be able to make their own goods, manufacture their own goods in the US, and on the other hand, obviously producers want to be able to sell their steel all over the world. So some of the historical examples of trade wars include, firstly, the first Opium War from the early 19th century that occurred between the British Empire and the Qing dynasty of China. Basically, the British Empire was trying to sell opium in China, but they imposed a ban on the sale of these goods within the Chinese territory. So this led to a war which eventually led to China losing Hong Kong to the British Empire, and China was eventually forced to open up their markets, and they weren't allowed to charge any import duties on any of the exports that the British Empire was trying to bring in to China. And this actually led to the downfall of the Qing dynasty and led to the modernization of China, and that's sort of how we got to where we are today, at least with the Chinese context. Another example would be right after the Great Depression in 1929, the economic shock was so large that the whole world went into a protectionist mood. So the US started it off by imposing import tariffs on goods from all over the world, and it was a tit-for-tat situation because every other country did the same thing as well. The problem with this is obviously protectionism in the long term is never a good idea. And because it isn't a good idea, the world's economy suffered. And as the world's economy suffered through the 30s, there was a rise of nationalism amongst all countries. And this rise of nationalism was one of the contributing factors to the outbreak of the Second World War. Finally, there was the one example that Donald Trump loves referring to is the import tariffs that Ronald Reagan imposed on Japanese goods back in the 80s. Now, similar to the situation today, Reagan in the 80s was concerned about the size of the trade deficit between the US and Japan. And back then, the US had a much larger bargaining power. So Reagan thought that by imposing tariffs on Japanese goods, Japan would eventually give in to the US's demands. Now, a lot of things occurred. There was a lot of back and forth between the two countries. But basically, over the next 10 years, the trade deficit continued to widen. The reason as to why this happened, and this is something that you'll find to be a common theme across all examples of trade wars that you'll ever come across, is that trade wars and tariffs with regards to reducing the trade deficit are not really the best course of action, because the reason why countries have a large trade deficit between each other has to do with a lot more than just trade. Take a look at the American and Chinese example today. The reason why America has such a large trade deficit with China is because they voluntarily decided to shift manufacturing from the West to the East, because manufacturing in the East is a lot cheaper. Now, when you manufacture most of the goods that you consume in another country and you have to buy it from that country, you are invariably going to have a large trade deficit. So we've just listed 3 examples of trade wars in the past. There are many more, but you'll find in pretty much every single case everyone ends up worse off after or during a trade war. So how did we get to this situation today? How are we in a trade war right now in the 21st century when it's already been agreed upon by most economists that this is a bad idea? Well, I guess the prime culprit here has to be Donald Trump. Throughout his campaign, he spoke about how you have to make America great again. And one of the things that he was referring to with this was the fact that America keeps losing to other countries when it comes to trade negotiations, and it's down to his lack of economic sort of knowledge, but he just doesn't seem to understand how global trade works. But regardless of which, we're already in this situation, and the reason we got here is because he kept threatening to impose tariffs on other countries because he thought this was the only way to get people to adhere to the US's terms. Of course, he doesn't seem to understand the concept of cooperation between nations when it comes to trade. And throughout his campaign, he threatened to do so, and he has done that. He started off with just threats, and now there are lists of goods worth up to $200 billion of Chinese goods that he's imposed tariffs on. And China, for its part, initially thought, okay, this is just a negotiation tactic. Maybe we could sort of give in and make some compromises. And when the first list of tariffs came out, China agreed that they would buy or they would spend more on American goods in an effort to reduce the deficit. And it looked like it was going well. The US Commerce Secretary was due to meet with trade representatives in Beijing, but just before he left to Beijing, Trump announced that he was in fact going to go through with the tariffs, because for a while there it looked like things were cooling down and it looked like we might be able to avoid a trade war. But in a surprise move, he decided that he was going to go ahead with it. And of course, he did the same with Canada, he did the same with the EU, and everyone has retaliated, because that is the best course of action when someone imposes tariffs on you. It makes no sense to not retaliate in these cases, and that's what all these countries have done. So the situation we find ourselves in right now is a state where the US has imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, on goods from the EU, and goods from Canada, and goods from Mexico, and all these other countries have done the same. So basically, they've made it more expensive to purchase things from each other. And what this does is it reduces the inefficiency of the supply chain and therefore just the global economy's day-to-day working. When you make everything more and more expensive for producers in your country to buy from each other, it's detrimental to the whole economy. And the worst part is that countries like India, countries like South Korea, countries like Taiwan, who are not even included in the spat per se, will also be affected because of the globalized nature of the world's economy today. So where do we go from here now that we are in a trade war? Well, earlier on in this video, we listed out previous examples, and I think we made it clear that in pretty much every single case, it was overall a detrimental situation, not only for the countries involved, but for the global economy as well. Today, the world's economy is far more globalized, and so the damage will be higher. Unless one of the countries, hopefully the US, decides to lay off and decides to go to a negotiation and actually speak with each other and make some sort of deal and some sort of agreement about the disputes that they have, that's the only real way where we can sort of come out of it now, because usually what happens in this sort of situation is it turns out to be a domino effect. As more and more countries begin to impose sanctions, everyone else will eventually have to start doing it because of a lack of choice. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, we have to hope that there is some common sense involved. It looks like China, Canada, and the EU all are perfectly well aware that not having a trade war is any day better than being in a trade war. But the problem here, the undefinable variable here, is Trump himself. If he doesn't decide to come to the negotiation table, and if he continues on with this stubborn attitude of just trying to bully everybody else into listening to him, then we're going to see more damage being done to the world's economy. And it's really just quite silly, the whole thing, because there's enough evidence, there's enough proof to tell us and to show us that trade wars just don't work. But unfortunately, we find ourselves in one right now. Well, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching, and be on the lookout for more of our videos. We'll be coming out with more very shortly.